Everybody, today is Thursday, January 26th. This is MS Office Hours. My name is Heather Cox. With me today are the fabulous co-hosts of
Victoria Dean,
Garrett Chandler,
Andrea Sangrio.
And I know folks are very, very excited for this session. Garrett, I'll let you do the official intro and then we'll let the presentation get started.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Well, welcome everyone. We're so excited to be joined by Meryl Fernando, who is a program product manager on the identity team, to talk about Graph API tips and tricks. So Meryl, I will turn it over to you to do a brief introduction, and you can get started. Thank you again for joining us. We're excited to have you here.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Garrett. I hope you can hear me clearly. My name is Meryl Fernando. I'm a senior product manager in the Azure AD Active Directory team. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, and one of the things I love working with is everything to do with Graph API, and Graph PowerShell. So I've just collected a bunch of tips on Graph PowerShell. Yeah, do you want me to just continue ahead?
Yep, that's great.
Cool. Awesome. So the first tip, I'm sure many of you know, but there's always new folks coming into the whole Microsoft sphere, and they don't really know about this sometimes, and it just gets lost. So the first tip I want to share is about Microsoft 365 Dev Tenant. You basically get a full-blown, fully licensed Microsoft tenant that you can use, and you can spin them up as many as you want, and it's just ready in like a few minutes. So to get your own tenant, just search for M365 Dev Tenant, and it's usually on like the top of the list. You go in there, say join now. You get this tenant that has not just a free tenant, but you get it with all of the sort of sample data. It says 90 days, but it keeps on renewing after that. So I have, for example, my dev tenant is about 6 years old now, one of my older ones. So that's a really free resource that anyone can use, spin it up to try out different things. And usually say if you have developers in your team or devs, we recommend each person have their own tenant so they can try out everything else. You don't need to wait for an admin to approve things for you to try things out. So that's my first tip if you didn't know about that. Yeah, so with that, I'll move on to Graph Explorer. Not sure how many of you have used Graph Explorer. So when you're working with Graph API, you need to run those queries and see how they work. If you're writing code or you're building an app, maybe a Power Automate, a Power App, etc., where you're using Graph calls, you can use Graph Explorer to quickly get there. So the first tip about Graph Explorer is how do you get to Graph Explorer? I usually like to use shortcuts with everything I do. So my first tip here with Graph Explorer is just go to ak.ms/ge. That'll get you straight into the Graph Explorer page. Or I created something called cmd.ms to get you shortcuts into almost everything in M365. It's community contributed, so there are heaps and heaps of links to things. Not much on the Office side, so maybe that's something folks can help with. But you just, if you want to get to Power BI, just type in pbi.cmd.ms and you get to the Power BI page. So that's like a really quick shortcut page that we have. And if you find anything that's not here, you can add them in. We also have like a browser extension. So you can do something like just type in C and just type power. It gives you a list of all the commands as well. So cmd.ms, just remember that it's sort of like the command line for the Microsoft Cloud. Yeah, so Graph Explorer is like getting to Graph Explorer is sort of the first tip that I wanted to share. The next one is just to get you familiarized with Graph Explorer. There are lots of sample queries that we show here on the left-hand side. You have things like applications, teams. You can just search for items here. So for example, say planner, you just type in planner and you get a whole bunch of queries that have been created for you, curated, like some of the more common ones. You just click on them and you get the query showing up here. So if you see the samples are shown here, and you can hit run query, and it will go through and run that query for you. So that's the next tip about using these sample queries on the left-hand side. You can also search for them. So remember that you can search for those sample queries. The next one, which folks don't really know who have been using Graph Explorer for a while, is that everything you query here in Graph Explorer, it goes into your history tab. And it also includes results. So if you click on it, you will see the queries come through. So you don't need to just copy or retype your query each time. Everything you've done in the last 30 days, they're all over here, and all you have to do is click on it, and it will run that query for you, and it'll even show the last results that you had. Right, so that's another tip about this. You can even download this and open it up in Fiddler or Postman, various tools like that. So you don't need to like type all of that stuff in again. Again, search is available here for those who don't know. Right, now sometimes when you're using Graph Explorer, you need to grant permissions. So when you call a specific query, an API, there's this whole idea about giving permissions to the app so that you can consent to it and run those permissions. If you click on this Modify Permissions tab, you'll actually see the list of permissions that are needed for a particular API. And this is an easy way you can search for these things in the doc. But if you want to say, I want to get a list of all the devices, what are the permissions I need for that? You will see this quickly refreshes and tells you what those permissions are. And if you want to run this query, if you haven't consented to it before, you can click consent and give that permission here. So this gives you a neat way to see these permissions. Now, sometimes when you're working with the beta APIs and the permissions are really new, they don't show up in this list here. Right? So there's a tip here where if you click on this and you click on the consent to permissions, you can actually see all of the permissions that are available in production at the moment. So this is where when it's something really new, the docs and that haven't been published out yet, you might need to come here and search for whatever the permission that you need, and you can then see them from here, and you can grant it to the Graph Explorer app. So another quick thing to remember while you're over here. Next is access token. So say you're working with the PowerShell, Graph PowerShell, or maybe you're building an app and you're sort of tired in your app where you need to just keep on signing in each time in your demo app, and it's sort of painful. So what you can do is if you want to, you sorted out all the permissions, you can see this access token here. You can take this and use it with any sort of API that needs the access token. So let me, for example, get here to Graph PowerShell, and I can do something like connect mggraph and pass in the access token. So I can paste the access token that I just copied and get through the overall, like the entire signing flow. So I don't need to do, all of the MFA, all those device checks, all of those can be skipped. You can just copy the access token and start using it in PowerShell. So a quick and easy way when you're writing code or building something where you're struggling with permissions, it works for you in Graph Explorer, but doesn't work in other places. You can quickly copy this access token, test it out to make sure that it's all working for the API, and then try to troubleshoot all the permission problems. I know I can spend an entire 2-hour session on consent and permissions and delegate and app permissions. So it's a very complex topic. This lets you get to sort of a really quick way across. I see a question, are these permissions granted to the user or to all the users? So it depends on how the admin consents to it. So when you go to consent to permissions, and if you click on this consent button, you see the dialog that comes up. And if you're an Office admin, you need to be really careful, or like, a global admin. Here, if you just click accept, it only grants it to the person that's doing the consenting. But if you select consent on behalf, you are consenting to everyone in your tenant using Graph Explorer. But sometimes you have a team of people and you want to give all of them access. What you can do is you can go to the permissions for Graph Explorer in apps, and you can limit who in your tenant is allowed to use Graph Explorer. So you can say search for Graph Explorer here, and here you can say limit Graph Explorer to just a bunch of users that you want to limit the access to. So you can say assignment required, yes, and then you can assign the users that can access the app. So if you go to users and groups, you can limit who can access Graph Explorer. So that way, even if you consent for the entire tenant, you can still scope it out to subset of these users. And it's really important if you're a global admin to know that prompt when it comes up, because you can be consenting, to the entire tenant to do something to get access to a particular app or grant an app access to your user data. Right. The next tip around this is when you call into APIs. So for example, you say get me, there's this tab at the bottom. Usually it shows you the results. But if you want to know what's the JavaScript version of it or the PowerShell version of that command, you can actually see that we do generate this sample code. So this is the same sort of, we have an engine that generates all these translation between languages. This is the same thing that drives our docs as well. So when you go to a doc and look at the different tabs, it's the identical thing that's showing up here. So this is a really quick way to get like some sample code that you can then use in your Teams app or whatever the language of your choice that you're building. Perfect. And the last one, this is something that's been added, if you haven't seen it before, that's been added sort of recently, is for a lot of the APIs, we've started linking the docs. So if you click on Learn More, you'll be taken to the Graph API reference to the exact page of the API command. So you don't need to go to Google, search for the reference, and then come here, because you just click there, you get to the docs, and you can browse through, look at all of the other examples. So it's a really powerful way where you can now switch between them quite easily. Right? So that's a important thing to remember. So it's for like almost all of the other APIs that you want. The same thing applies. So you can say learn more. You'll be taken to the Grid profile page, and you know all of the different parameters that you can pass in, etc. Nice. Right. So while I'm here, a quick tip about a browser extension that I built. One of my teams, we worked on a hackathon. We built this out called Graph X-Ray. So it is a PowerShell. It's an extension that's available for Chrome, Edge, and there's even like a desktop app. So you can get the extension. Once you install the extension, you can go into any of the blades. So for example, let me go to AD, let's say users. And it's something that I need to show how it works. So what this does is, if you any of the blades that you use in Azure AD is a good example. Intune is another good example. These portals are built using Graph API themselves. So if you want to look at what the calls are being made behind the scenes, you can actually click on this and you can see the Graph API commands that are being run behind the scenes, and you can copy and you can run them. And there's support for multiple languages as well. So if you're writing JavaScript and you want to see what's the API, for example, say you're trying to edit a user and you change the name and you hit save, the Graph API commands for that are shown. So this is good. It works well with any of the blades that are using Graph API. Not all of the portals use Graph API, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, depending on how the devs that build the portal have done. But it can be anything. It can be your own SharePoint app or a Teams app that you're building and it's using Graph API or someone else has built. You can look at what they're doing behind the scenes when they're calling into Graph Explorer. So it's a browser extension, works across the board with everything, and you can do this sort of thing. So for example, if I switch to PowerShell and maybe say I change Adele's name and I hit save, you can see how it shows, the update command and what's being passed, like even for creating a new group, etc. And you can download that script as well, right? So it came out of a hackathon that we worked on. Feel free to try it out and give us feedback on that. Right, Graph API, the reference docs. So this is, if you're working with Graph, you need to go to the Graph API docs all the time. There is a short link for that, which is Graph Ref, and you'll be taken to the Graph API reference docs quickly. So that's another tip. Just remember these commands, what I call them cloud commands, and you'll be able to get to that.
Are changing.
The resource types and properties. So one of the things that you need to remember or that you might not be aware with the APIs is when you browse into these APIs, say, for example, for a user, you'll see like, okay, how do we create a user? And you'll see that in this example, there's a small example of how you create a user. Some of the parameters are given, and that's it. But what if you want to do something a bit more complex? You want to maybe assign a license. How do you do that as you create a user? So there are a bunch of few examples given, but it just stops at that. You don't have much information about what you need to pass in if you want to, assign a license or do some of the more complex other properties that you need. So what I always do, and it's a trip that I remember, is with all of these objects, you have this resource object that's linked to it, right? So when you go to this, and if you select one of these objects, you can see that there are these other parameters listed for that particular object. You can then know how you go about passing in those parameters for there. So say with the contact folder, you can see all of these other information that you pass in, and you can look at how you call into that. So let me use a better example. Say, for example, when I use groups, right? So create a group, right? We go to the member object, you create a group. You can see, okay, let me to, yeah, the group object here. Right, so when you create a group, you can say you have the group reference, and when you go into the group resource type, you can actually see all of the objects here. But when you scroll down into the parameters, over here you can see all of the different attributes that you can pass in, and you can also see if you need to filter on one of these, what are the filter operations that are supported, because filter is not uniform across the board. So if you need to search on something, some properties support some attributes, some support others. So this lets you see what are the different filter options that are available. And if you have things like magic strings, for example, let me find an example here, license processing state. You also get a list of all the supported values over here. So scrolling down into the object itself and looking at the reference gives you a lot more information about that particular item. And you can see, for example, preferred language. It's a string. What are the things that you can pass to it? They're all listed here, and you can find out about them. Or, for example, resource behavior options. You can see all of the possible values that are listed here. So using this gives you sort of a quick way to go in and look at that. So the graph docs, there are a lot of information here that people usually find it very challenging when they first start working with Graph API. But if you know how to navigate within the Graph API docs, it becomes easier. One thing that that you might or might not be aware is all of these are written by folks and they could make mistakes. So if you do find something wrong, for example, maybe there's a typo in one of these that you want to suggest, you can click on the link here when you say this page, and you can say once you sign in, you can actually raise a ticket against that item. And we have our docs team that actually will help out. So I'll just open it out in browser where I do have a graph signing, and you can see, click here. Yeah, and you can open, it takes you straight into the graph docs page where you can see, the other issues, but you can also open an issue. So you can contribute towards improving the Graph API and Graph API docs. And these are all handwritten by folks, the various feature teams that build these APIs, they basically go in and put this in. So you can always, if you find anything, that can be improved, please do share. And my last set of tips is to do with the graph filter, because a lot of the times you want to report out, get information out of graph, and it becomes a little, challenging when you need to find out what some things do, what graph filters work, what don't. So if you go to aka.ms/graph filter, you will get to the docs about querying Graph API. And because the support is not uniform across all of the APIs, you will need to know, how you can call them, etc. So this gives you a summary of all of the APIs that you can call, lots of different examples about the Graph API. You can also go into the advanced query capabilities, and it's a neat page that gives you a list of all the properties, mostly with the directory objects, and what operations are supported. So you don't need to get frustrated trying out things which fail. You can just come here and know, for example, starts with doesn't work with a lot of these things. So it's a really easy way to look at this. And you can also do this with Graph X-ray. So if you go back to the user's blade, the user's blade has a lot of filters. So you can say account enable equals true, and you can see that parameter. You can keep adding, let's see, I want to also add city, starts with, says the letter C, and you apply. You can then see the entire sort of the Graph API that's being used here. So, you don't need to write that query yourself. You can just type in account enable equals true and starts with C. You quickly get to the filter that's being applied. So that's a quick way to get to the finding out the filters that are working out of the box without writing in lots of code. Right. So remember these. This is a really useful or a handy page, which is graph aka.ms/graph filter will get you there. Right. And these are the advanced queries that you can use to get to that information. So what are the languages available? So it supports all the languages that the DevX team help in generating. So the languages include C#, JavaScript, Go, Objective-C as well. Right, so some of those things. Right, and I think that was the last of my tip. I think I'll stop there because we'll run out of time for the other stuff. I hope this quick session was helpful. You learned something new, at least one new thing.
Yeah, it looks
That's
like we're
awesome,
getting
Meryl.
positive feedback in the chat here. So awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks so much, Meryl. I should have prefaced, when we had met, it was back before Christmas, right? We had asked you all to fill out that whiteboard of different suggestions, and this was one of the top asks was Graph API and interacting with PowerShell. And Meryl, I mean, kudos to you and your team for developing these awesome extensions. I didn't know about this, so really cool stuff. I'm excited to go try it out. I hope Actually, I'll let the chat speak for itself. It looks like best session
Yeah.
ever. So awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. We do have a few more minutes, Meryl, if you're okay.
Yep.
There looks like there might be a few questions. And if anyone wants to come off, it looks like Chris has a specific question around admin consent. Is that something that you can answer?
Yeah, so with admin consent restricted by user group, is it possible to escalate permissions using PIM? Yeah, so consent is always when you give provision, when you grant consent to an app, it's granted to the app itself. You can't use PIM to elevate. PIM is more about privileged identity management. For those who don't know, it's more about elevating a person's access just for them to do something. So is your question whether you can consent, only allow certain people to consent? If that's the case, yes, you can only allow certain people in the tenant to consent. Global admin always can, but there's a role called application administrator. You can limit that to that role as well. So you can delegate, the consenting permissions to other users. I hope that was a question. If not, feel free to ping me. So I usually hang out on Twitter a lot at Merrill, Merill. Feel free to post questions on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll be able to answer stuff.
That's
Graph
fantastic.
API report results to a CSV. Yes, so that's another tip that I should share. So ak.ms/graph sample. So I'm working with the community to build out a lot of graph PowerShell samples. So is there a way to export results to a CSV? Yes, yeah. So I wrote this one recently for someone who wanted to get a list of all the users in the tenant and all the licenses for a user. This PowerShell script, you just copy this and run it. It basically downloads all of the users, and for every license, whether it's E5, Power BI, Power Apps, you get the license and you get the list of the users and what SKUs are enabled or disabled per person into splits out the CSV. So this particular customer was running it every day and creating these CSVs and using it for their various reporting. So aka.ms/graph samples should help you. I'll share that over here as well.
That's fantastic. And yeah, we're dropping some links in here around training and some other pieces of information. So thank you, Meryl, for joining us. Thank you to the whole group for joining us. I should be able to get this uploaded very quickly, especially since it sounds like people would like to watch this again. So I will get this up on YouTube as soon as I can and share the link out. And just thank you so much for coming in and doing such an incredible session. We will see everybody again next week, hopefully, and I'll go ahead and stop the recording and